Okay, so we'll just march on. All right. So now I'm going to build and present the model that George Akerlof and I have on minority poverty. Okay. So what you're going to see is that this model is based on the so we're going to operationalize that utility function, which you've already seen one example for the high school students. So we're going to operationalize that utility function and get a model of minority poverty. So I should say that this model is all about greens and reds. You're going to see we've got green people and red people. You could easily rewrite this as black and whites. We decided consciously not to write it as black and whites in the model, which it turns out to have confused everyone. But the idea, it could be greens and reds. It doesn't have to be black and whites. It could be, any sort of division within a society. And what's going to be really key in this model is a parameter. You always have to have a parameter. But it's the parameter. Somebody asked me about getting beaten up, right? I think you would ask me about that. What happens when you try and be in a group to which you don't belong? Okay, that's going to be the key parameter here. So we have a large population of individuals, and now our individuals are homogeneous. So again, let me say something at the very beginning. We're going to be looking at a population that's deciding whether to be green or red. Okay? There's a population of other people out there who are automatically green. Okay? And so we're not thinking about those folks. We're about the people who are sort of trying to decide whether to be green or red. Does that make sense? So you have to think green as the majority population and sort of people deciding whether or not to try and be part of the majority. Either integrate, assimilate, pass, whatever word you want to use. Okay? And these people have a characteristic where that doesn't fit with the majority. Okay, so we have a large population of individuals. They all have this particular characteristic, epsilon, and there's two actions. So this is, I'm going to be doing this as working or schooling and not. So there's activity 1 and activity 2. So the economic payoffs, activity 1 yields some economic payoff, call it V sub I. Notice there's an individual specific return. And activity 2 yields nothing. Anyone who does 1 pays K if they meet somebody who does 2. Okay, so what you want to think about this in this particular population of individuals, if I decide to go to work, right, then I suffer a kind of cost when I meet somebody in my community who doesn't. Okay? So there's some sort of negative externality in the economic payoffs, which we could ignore if we really wanted to. There's crime that I could be subject to, and so on. So this is the economic payoffs. So we've got economic payoffs from activity 1 and activity 2. This is not very interesting, but it's in the model. Okay. So now we introduce social categories. There's two social categories, green and red. Greens, if you decide to be green, greens should, that's the should, take action 1. Green should work. If you're a red, you shouldn't. You shouldn't work, right? You should just decide to rebel or stay home, whatever it is. Okay, and the ideal, they say the physical characteristics for being green is not the one that this population has. So again, you can think about this as whites and blacks, right? So blacks have black skin. In order to be really white, you can't have black skin. Okay, so this is a physical characteristic. And it's important that this is, social excluding. So I'm explicitly introducing social exclusion here. It's the definition of the category green. Does not include these folks. Okay? Then we have identity utilities. An individual loses R if they adopt the green identity but don't fit the ideal. So this is the parameter I was describing. If you are in this population and your characteristic is E star and you adopt the green identity, right? Right, but you don't have the characteristics for this green identity, then you're socially excluded and you lose R. You could be beaten up, right? Something happens to you. So somebody asked me about, how can you just change, your category? This is if you try, something's going to happen to you. Okay? So R is the extent to which, you can think about R is the extent to which people in the dominant group or the majority group accept somebody who doesn't look like them into their group. Okay, if R is high, then the punishment or against the person who tries to integrate is very high. That's the way you want to think about it. Okay? Are you with me? So this is what the person who gets beaten up if they try and go into the majority group. If an individual is red, if an individual is red, they decide that they want to be a red person, but then they do activity 1, they lose some sort of identity utility. So if you decide to be a red person and not a green person, but still you go to work, then you lose, you suffer because you're sort of not being real to who you are. Okay? And an individual who decides to be a green loses this identity utility if they meet somebody who's decided to be a red in their group, because the person who's red in their group does not accept the person's choice to be green. Okay, so this is a lot of parameters floating around, but here's what you want to think about it. I'm in a minority community, and I can decide to try and be part of the majority. Okay? If I decide to be the part of the majority, there's things that happen to me socially. There's sort of these identity payoffs. One is that I'm socially excluded. I'm made to feel bad. Okay, I'm made to feel bad. Maybe I get beaten up. Maybe it's a physical kind of cost. And then I should say, if I decide to be green, right? So now I've decided to be green. The first thing that happens is the other people in that majority group don't like me, right? They socially exclude me. The other thing is my own community excludes me. That's this, right? My own community, the other people who have not made this choice exclude me too. Okay, so that's this parameter here, right? And the other thing, so that's if I decide to be green. If I make the opposite choice and decide not to be green, I don't try and fit into the majority group, right? I don't try and fit in the majority group. So I adopt a red identity. I adopt an identity that's not the identity of the majority group, but I go to work, right? So I do the opposite of the ideal action for my community, then I feel bad about who I am. Okay, so you with me? Okay, so this is just putting some parameters on this identity utility function. Okay, I think that's enough of those. There's one more of those. Okay, so what you do is you build a model where these individuals randomly match, and they earn payoffs given their own identity, action, and those of whom they meet. So in equilibrium, each individual is maximizing their payoffs, giving choices of others in the population. So basically, an individual has these 4 options. They can decide to be green, and if they decide to be green, they could get beaten up. So that's in there, right? You can try to be green, but you get beaten up, right? You can decide to be green, and you do activity 1. You decide to be green and do activity 2. Hold on. You decide to be red and do activity 1. You can decide to be red and do activity 2. Right? So all of these are possible choice. These are the choice combinations of an individual. Okay, are you with me? And then the payoffs are going to depend on what proportion of the population makes each of these choices. Just one second. So if I decide to be green, but the rest of my community decides to be red, then I suffer those exclusion penalties from my community even more because I'm meeting a lot of people within my community who've decided to be red. Okay? So my equilibrium is going to depend, my actions are going to depend on what everybody else does. And so we're going to look for equilibria. Yes?
Maybe I'm mixing something up, but I just want to clarify. So if somebody from the red community would like to become green, so is he pays a punishment for this, but will he, we are not speaking at the moment for the repeated game, but if we put it in the setting of the repeated game, would he be accepted as a green community once he pay a punishment?
Which punishment by whom?
By both communities.
Well, so this is a static model, so ultimately we might want to think about dynamics on R. So R is what happens to you if I'm in this community and I decide to be green. And it's like, I'm here, get used to it, get used to it, get used to it. And you keep telling this to the people in the majority community, I'm here, get used to it. Maybe R eventually falls, but I don't have that in the model. So this is about, now we're looking at the dynamics of these identity payoffs, and we don't have that in the model. And again, my sense of what goes on is there's social movement surrounding what is R. That's exactly what people fight about.
So, but here, effectively, they can't switch between the classes. So,
Sorry?
Here, effectively, they cannot switch between the classes.
They can. But there's going to be different identity payoffs and utility payoffs, or sort of economic payoffs in each case. exactly. Right, and then that punishment could be high or low. That's going to be a parameter in the model. There's punishments from the majority group and punishment from their own group as well. But there are also economic benefits from working. So activity 1 here gives you money. Yeah?
So there's only asymmetry between G and R, is that you're making this last assumption, you can set it up so that we always dominate G1, always dominates G2. Otherwise, the groups are...
Except...
or am I missing something?
No, well, because there's differences because if you're green, if you're in this community and you decide to be green, you suffer R. You get this little small R. Right? So the difference between R1, let's do the difference between R1 and G1. Okay? So in both of these, you're working, so you get some economic payoff. That's activity 1. So in both of those cases, you work and you get an economic payoff. If you're in G1 here, so you're working and you decide to be green, the majority community punishes you, and possibly people in your own community punish you if you meet a bunch of red people in your own community. Okay. If you're here, right, and you've decided to be red, but you're working to get money, right, people in the majority community don't punish you because you're not trying to be like them, you're just working. Okay? But because adopting a red identity, the ideal is that you shouldn't work. You shouldn't be engaged in the activities of the majority community. You're an Uncle Tom. This is the sort of Uncle Tom person, or that people will accuse of being an Uncle Tom, or that you may feel bad about it. Okay, so you're not accepted. So it's hard to know which one of these is like that, but you see the difference? So in each one of these, there's a penalty. There's both identity penalties, but of different sorts. Okay, does that help? Now these guys here, they're red, and they do activity 2. So they don't try to be part of the majority community, and they conform to the norms for the minority. They don't work, or they don't participate in school. Okay. So again, you can do this all in terms of schooling. This is somebody who tries to be this sort of burnout or rebel person, but in secret, tries to be good at school, but he feels bad about it. It's like all weird, to be doing this. Okay? Is that helpful? Okay. So we're going to let G be the proportion of the population that adopts G1, and P be the portion of Rs that adopt 1. So first, we divide the population between Gs and Rs, and then we divide further this population of Rs between those that work and that don't work. Okay? And we simply look for equilibrium values of G and P. Okay? And it's going to depend, so for different proportions of the population can be sustained as an equilibrium. Because what happens, again, if you're a G, if you decide to be a G and you work, again, you suffer R no matter what. But the extent to which you suffer from exclusion from your own community depends on how many people have decided not to be green but to be R. Yes, we're going to have coordination failures here. Exactly. We're going to have multiple equilibria that can lead to coordination failures. Exactly. That's what's going to go on. Okay, so does everybody understand dynamics? It's a static model, but the way the different payoffs work and the proportions of the population. So we're going to look for G and P that give us equilibria. Okay. That's what I just said. First, we divide the population into Gs, and then we divide the Rs into P and 1 minus P. So here's the payoffs from each option. So this is just what I was saying before. So here, I'll just go through one of them. If you decide to be green and you work, you earn money. You suffer because you're trying to be part of the majority, but they don't accept you, right? Then here's the proportion of the population that has decided not to be G. These are reds, right? These are the red people, and they exclude you, right? This is how much other people in your community don't like you, don't want to hang out with you, and so on, because you've decided to be green, okay? And this is this term I really don't need. This is the economic payoff that you suffer because you work and your returns to work could possibly be stolen or destroyed. So you actually really don't need that term. That's not so interesting. Okay, so you go through each one of these and go through the identity payoffs that I just described. Do you want me to go through another one? Yes? Okay. So this one here, this is a red person, a person who's decided to be red and starts and works. So this person earns VI because they're working, right? But they feel bad about it because, you know, if you decided to be red, you really shouldn't be being complicit with the majority community, right? You've got to do things that make you feel uncomfortable within that majority community because you've decided that you don't want to be like them, but yet you are, you know, interacting with these folks, and it's not your norm to be acting this way. So there's lots of discussions in the literature about trade-offs of, say, African Americans who are in workplaces that are in these workplaces and that they have to somehow hide who they truly are. And what they truly are is not green. Okay, so that's what this term is meant to represent. Okay, these are the people who, so what is this? These are the people who, now if you're a red, yeah, this term I didn't describe. If you're a red, this is the proportion of your community who are green, and they're really mad at you for being red, right? Because a lot of people would say, come on, guys, let's all integrate, right? And you've decided not to do that, and people are saying, come on, what are you know, so the green people are mad at you. That's what that is. The green people within your community are mad at you. And then here's this economic cost, which really doesn't matter. Okay?
Sorry, what does it mean, green people within your community?
Yeah, so what this is, so what this term right here, so I actually skipped this on the previous slide. So G is the proportion of the population that is decided, that a portion of your community who is green, but you're red.
Oh, I see. What is your community?
So your community is everybody with this characteristic epsilon star.
So you match only with these people?
No, yes, you only match with these people. Yeah. So this is all about the community within you're in, and some proportion of them try to integrate, some of proportion don't. And so if everybody tries to integrate and you don't, the people who integrate get mad at you. If you integrate but everybody else doesn't, then they get mad at you. So well, that's right. So you can move somewhat. Well, we don't have that in the model. Yes, but people try and do that, of course. So what we don't have here would be the ability to escape this altogether, or we was chatting in the little break with perhaps individuals place more or less weight on all of these social interactions within your community. I don't care. You know, who are you to tell me how I should behave just because we have the same skin color? I'm out of here. I don't care, right? Or because I'm a woman. Who are you to tell me how I should act as a woman just because you made different choices than I did, right? So I've talked to several of you about what I call the mommy wars. What does it mean to be a good mother? I made my choices to do what I wanted to do, and some people are telling me now I'm a bad mother or I'm a good mother, right? So now I can say, I don't care what you think. We don't have that parameter in the model, but you can imagine heterogeneity in that parameter as well. Okay, so again, this is a group of people who are defined similarly, right? So you want to talk about them as African Americans or Hispanics or women, right? And they interact within that community, and if they've made a different choice of identity, right, of green or red, than other people in their community, but they're still matching with them, then they're going to get some grief. That's what all of these I-zeros are. Okay, so I ran through another line. Are we helpful? Are we good now with these payoffs? Okay. Okay, so this poor guy, he suffers, right, but he doesn't get this VI term here. Okay, and he doesn't get any of this. All right, so there are multiple equilibria, as you've already guessed. There's multiple equilibria, and the existence of the different equilibria depend on this R, this social exclusion parameter. So you can have equilibria where all individuals, well, possible ones, I'm going to show you the parameters for which these will exist. All individuals are green, some are red, and for there's three kinds of equilibria you can imagine. Everyone's green, everyone's red, or some people are green and some people are red. Okay? So all green, everyone deciding to integrate is only in equilibrium if and only if this exclusion from the majority is sufficiently small. Okay, so that's incredibly important, and we really want to emphasize in this model. R is the clique parameter, is the extent to which this minority group is viewed as not cannot be part of the majority. It's the way the majority group is defined right? That determines whether or not people can be, whether or not we have an equilibrium where the people from this group try to integrate. If R is in an intermediate range, then you have the population split between some people being green and working, and some people being R and not working. Okay, and then you get the split. And if R is sufficiently high, you only get people being red. Okay, so does everyone understand that there's nothing extraordinarily deep in deriving these equilibria? Right? We're just looking for the range of the parameter values where you get these different equilibria, right? And again, you can either get everybody being green, so nobody suffers these identity externalities, right? But that's only going to happen if when you decide to be green, nobody's beating you up, right? Otherwise, right, you don't want to get beaten up, so you're in this world where you within your group are deciding, how you're going to work this out. You as an individual, and you're getting all these identity externalities for some of you being green and some of you being red, right? But when R is really high, everybody's red because because people, the cost of even trying to be green is too high. Now you might want to understand, where is the population split between G1 and R2? It's all in the VIs. We're going to find a critical VI, right, such that for some people in the population, working is worth it, and for other people in the population, it's not, right? It's all in this term right here. Because if you look at the difference between these two terms, forget this one, that's meaningless. The difference between these two terms is right here. So the high VI people, right, well actually it's here, the high VI people are going to work, okay? Right, so now we have a model of minority poverty where people, essentially, we've got an outcome where people are, going back to this acting white phenomenon, we've got a model where people who try to integrate in this community, into the majority community, are accused of acting white by their people who try and integrate into the majority community are accused of acting white by the minority community, and that's that punishment, right? So I've included in this model a lot of these social and identity variables, right? So this is explicitly a model about a group that is being excluded from the majority. Okay? And so the key parameter, in contrast to going back to the Fryer model, in the Fryer model, the key parameter is whether or not, from an individual's point of view, scratch that. In the Fryer model, the Austin-Smith-Fryer model, the key parameter was this V underbar, which was the value for a peer group of accepting you, right? The key parameter in this model is the extent to which you are accepted in the majority culture. Okay, that's this R. So it's placing the responsibility, right, on the majority culture and whether or not it's accepting you in the definition of what it means to be green. And that's what all of the debates are about, right? That's what the civil rights laws are about. They're saying all of these things. You have to accept people, right? There's all of the discussion about political correctness and the jokes you can make, and all of these things are about R. Okay, so do you see the difference in the parameters that are driving these things? Any model is going to have some key parameters that are going to drive your results. The question is, what are interpretation of them and how do we understand them? Yes?
So what happens if you match, if you were to change this matching so that you can match with you outside your community? So you're saying
well, so in some sense, we kind of have it here. So it's this R. So you're matching, what you want to do is be able to match, so here we have you matching outside, if you're a green, you match with people outside your community, you automatically suffer R. That's what that is, actually. If you think, it's...
Yeah, because I was understanding it to say that, black people are poor because they already are poor and living together in some communities. So it seems like, you know what I mean? So what happens, like, if you start them out, like, identical, where they can bump into.
Well, so again,
without the same.
So again, if we have R very small, we have no problem whatsoever. We have an equilibrium where everyone's green. So this is, first of all, this is a multiple equilibrium model. There's a coordination problem, right? There's a coordination issue. Okay, so first of all, we have multiple equilibria, and the question, and I guess one thing that's interesting to us is, when will you ever have an equilibrium when everyone can be green? It depends on R being sufficiently small. Okay, so again, it's a model of multiple equilibria. It's a model that generates multiple equilibria.
Yeah, it was just going back to this idea that if you can move.
Well, you want to be able to move, so.
Stop bumping into people that are calling you Uncle Tom, right?
Right, so where you move to, so here, so if you want to move to, so yeah, we don't have that here. So if you could, there's lots of things that people actually do, is they're going to try and affect, people will try and affect R. You know, in fact, we have a whole big discussion. People are going to affect I0. People are going to try and affect IS. Everyone's going to be saying, no, it's okay. You can be black and work. It's no problem. You can keep it real and still be working in a firm. It's no problem. You know, all of these parameters are, again, subject to discussion and debate and change and so on. Here you might say, well, people just leave, right? But where are they going to go? In this model, there's no place for them to go. You know, you could just cut out. You want to cut out all of these things, you're just going to be stuck with this. So cut out all of this stuff, and then you're going to just have VI versus R. Right? So it's just going to depend on that. And then if you just strip down this model completely, and there's no social interactions within the group whatsoever, within the minority community whatsoever, right? That's all gone. That's all of these terms, all that, and that. And the only thing we're left with is that term right there. Right. So by the way, this is not a social interaction term. Okay, that's not. These are all the I0s are the social interaction terms. Yeah.
So, just trying to relate the two models. So in one way, I would have thought, just trying to see whether that's happening here, is that is there a sense in which there are both, you know, the minority community externalities and punishments, etc., and also the R, which is the punishment from the majority community. So is there a sense in which this model embeds the other model? Or is there a way to think about, you know, to embed the Fryer-Austin-Smith model? Or is this a model where basically you have one, and you know, somehow they are looking at two different kinds of things?
So that's a great question. I guess I would say that, what would I say? I guess I would say that we could probably embed we don't, the Austin-Smith-Fryer model. Well, again, you could build a meta model, right? Because that fundamentally what's going on in their model is this information asymmetry. Yeah. Right? And here there's just no information asymmetry. So this is weak on social interactions, right? This is all coming from social interactions and from R. Right? So there's no information asymmetry here, which is driving these equilibria. It's just all from the social interactions, and you know, we can think about which is not modeled very explicitly, but the social interactions between the majority and the minority, which is captured by R. So
is a full information Austin-Smith-Fryer model then?
They can't get any of this in a full information case.
Can that be accommodated?
Yeah, so in a full information Austin-Smith-Fryer model, everybody just acts optimally, and everyone gets the right level of education, and so on. Right. So this is a model of so again, this is a model of identity plus social interactions. Right. All of these I0s that are floating around here, and the R. Okay. Whereas that's a model of, you know.
Yeah, you just have like one instrument, you're trying to signal two different things. And so
yeah, it's
if you have fewer instruments.
No, I understand that, but I was thinking that, you know, it would be useful to compare the models on some sort of in a way that, yeah, I'm not actually able to see, because there's a signaling thing going on there.
right, and that's the heart of it. If there was complete, so here, yeah.
But sort of thinking whether the full information part of that model, which actually doesn't have any much action.
So the full information part of that model is that the high sociability types enjoy leisure, so they don't go to school very much, and that's it.
So essentially, when you add these community punishments in that sort of a framework, you would probably get multiple equilibria, even with the full information.
Exactly. Yes.
Suspect.
Yes. Absolutely. Oh, yes.
So, what you get I was wondering if that value might change with art, because if your punishments are quite low, you might actually be entitled to a higher wage. Is that possible?
Well, so I guess I don't want to think about, there's all different things one could build in this. We think about dynamics on R, individuals. In fact, we talk a lot about this paper. Third parties trying to change I0, third parties trying to change IS, legislation trying to change IR, whole discussions among the majority community about what R is and where it comes from. So, and whether or not actually this is preserved, right? So some people will argue there's some models out there by people who were writing just around the same time we were, where you can reinterpret those models that are all about building R to keep those people out. Okay, so there's a whole set of papers that are, again, you could reinterpret them in this framework, which the whole point of those models is you make R high, and you make all of the majority people beat up all of the minority people to preserve, their higher wages and so on. So there's a set of papers out there that do that. So again, what I'm trying to do is illustrate here, we've got in here the social interactions, we've got in here the prescriptive norms, we've got in here the majority being defined against the minority. That's what's going on here, right? Whereas you would not get any of that in a kind of a signaling model. The signaling model, everything is coming from whether a peer group, how much it enjoys other members. That's what's there. You don't have majority, minority, nothing. Yeah, okay, I'll take two more and then I want to move to the rest. Go ahead.
Just quickly, I was wondering if you could talk a tiny bit more about the interpretation of actions 1 and 2, because we've been calling them working and not working.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, is it a little bit richer than that? Because the idea that poverty is simply caused by voluntary unemployment is not.
Well, so again, you can think about, this is, I guess, purposely vague, but maybe the schooling example is a little bit clearer. Is whether or not you exert effort in school or not. And so this could be a model of acting white, though we didn't label it that way. That's what it is.
So it's more like working in school.
No, but it could also be working. So there's also a lot of discussions about African Americans in the workplace and how they feel when they're in the workplace. Are they working for the man or not? It's a little bit bit of a joke now because the white people talk about working for the man. I don't know if you've seen some of these comedy routines. But, that's the, I guess Shahar has. Okay. So it's the idea is that if you work, you're working for your oppressors. That's the interpretation of activity 2. And that's the interpretation of activity 1 for Reds. And that's why they don't want to do it. Right? So you're working for the man. Right. And now there's comedy routines. This stuff has entered common, discussions. Now white people don't want to work for the man and so on. So, but anyway, that's a whole other story. Okay, but do you understand the idea generally? Yeah.
So is it particular kinds of work, or is it?
Well, again, we could, yeah. We might, well, actually, I'd like to move on. So one could embellish this and think about maybe there's different categories of work which are okay and some not okay and so on, and whether Reds think it's okay to do this versus that, and so on. Yeah?
I'm just curious, another different model. Do you think some sort of connection between your parameter of punishment are and in the model of Shell, when people can move, let's say, the movement actually doesn't have to be geographical movement, but can be like that, want to isolate, want to go far from people.
Yeah. So actually, I just realized that, of course, Kaivan yesterday was all talking about the costs of moving away from your community, right? If you need your community for something, right, perhaps material goods, then maybe you can't move as easily, right? So there's all this other stuff that we should be adding to this too, right? It's easy enough to say that I'm going to move across the country and move to California.
California, yes.
Well, if I'm in my country and I move to California.
Yes.
Right. But maybe it's not so easy. Okay, so what I'd like to do is now switch gears entirely and talk about experiments. It's not really entirely, because we're still going to be talking about identity and inequality, but now it's in the context of experiments. So what I want to do now is, again, sort of some switching gears. So I have a lot of work on establishing the framework of identity, building this utility function, putting it in these little toy models, getting out some predictions, getting out some policy prescriptions. I would love for people here to be working more on the theory. Where does identity come from? How do the norms evolve? Where does, who invests in R and changes it? All of these things. There's multiple identities, right? Enormous amount of open questions within the theory, and I'd absolutely love for people to be working on that. The other areas in which we're starting to see some work, so there are a few papers in that area. The other areas which we're starting to see some work are in experiments involving identity and social groups, as well as some empirics. Okay? And the issue, as we all know, because Shachar gave a wonderful discussion about the methodology of economic experiments, is how much can we actually capture in the lab? What are we really doing in the lab, and so on, and external validity. The problem with identity, as opposed to some of these more market kinds of outcomes, is that it's pretty hard, and though what I'm really stunned by is how some empirical researchers are able to find data sets that they can use to sort of test different hypotheses about the effects of identity on outcomes, right? But it's really, again, I don't know how people do it, but it's, to publish something in economics, you need some sort of exogenous variation or instrumentation for some sort of change in identity or some sort of change in norms, and it's really hard to find data where you can do that. So one place you do is you turn to the lab. But of course, we know that there's pitfalls of lab experiments. That all said, let me tell you about some of the work that's been done. So experiments with social groups and identity. Do people behave differently towards others depending on their identity or social groups? So I've kind of divided up the experiments into 3 different kinds of experiments. I think there are 3. 1, 2, yeah, 3. Good. Okay. One is where you just simply ask, do people do something different when their own identity is salient? So they're not interacting with anybody. They're not interacting with anybody. They're not giving anybody money. They're not worried about competition. You just simply make their identity salient to them, and do they do something differently that's economically meaningful? Okay. Another example of these experiments is where you have subjects in the lab, and now you've sort of divided the subjects into social groups, or you've made their identity salient, and they're acting differently towards other subjects in the experiment. So there's actually something going on between the subjects in the experiment, either not actually interacting, but maybe giving people money or so forth. There's some other person involved, not just yourself. And then there's this work on social preferences, which is not exactly, it's not really strategic play, but here it's just you're giving money to some other person. Okay, so I'm not sure where I should have put that one. It's not really here or here, but that's the one I'm going to be talking about more at length. And here's where I sort of gave you this bullet point in the very beginning. Do people have preferences for inequality? And the answer is yes. So I'm going to show you a study that I've done with my colleagues where we can show that people actually will pay to make the outcome, the distribution of income, unequal. Okay, so they want the distribution of income to be unequal. So of course the challenge in these experiments, the challenge of the experiment is to design these experiments that have some sort of social group variation, and there's really 2 ways to do that. Some sets of experiments exploit real world groups where you have some sort of different ethnicity among the subjects. They're different members of different clubs. Now when you do this kind of thing, you have to worry about preserving anonymity in the lab. So while you're all from the same Swiss Army platoon, you also have to make sure that you're not going to go out and punish this person because you knew they were participation in the subject. So you worry about what goes on outside the lab too. The other method is to create groups inside the lab, and I'll show you how that's done. You sort of divide subjects into groups according to some arbitrary criteria. You perhaps establish some sort of community by having them chat with each other or do some joint task. Okay, so those are 2 ways of doing it. So the first thing I'm going to do is, what I'm going to do now is talk about some of these own actions experiments, some about the strategic play experiments, and something about the social preferences. And we'll see how far we go. Okay, so the first one is just own behavior. Who knows about the stereotype threat? Have anyone heard about it? Stereotype threat? Okay. So, good. I will, hopefully teach you guys something. What is stereotype threat? So it originates in this studies by Claude Steele and I think it's Joshua, though it might be Jason Aronson, from 1995. And these are 2 folks at Stanford. I don't have much explanation there, but let me describe it to you. So their basic paper, their very first study was this. It's at Stanford, and they had Stanford undergrads, and they gave Stanford undergrads SAT type questions, and they gave Stanford undergrads SAT type questions in 3 different conditions. The difference between the conditions that's relevant for us to talk about is that one of the conditions, the SAT questions, these are African American students and white students. Okay. And the difference between these conditions is that in one condition, the students were generally told, these are questions about your intellectual ability. Okay, that's one condition. And another condition, these are questions that we're testing out to see if they're good questions. Can you work on them for us? And I'm sure it was worded much better than that, but that's the idea between these two conditions. Okay, you get the setup? And the result is that African American students systematically underperformed in the condition where they were told the test was a test of their intelligence. Okay? You with me? So the idea is that this frame that was presented to the students when they were given these SAT questions, the one where they were told that this SAT questions were tests of intelligence, there is a stereotype threat, that's the interpretation, a stereotype threat. These students felt that the stereotype of African American students is that they're not very intelligent, they can't perform well, and so therefore there's a higher level of anxiety. When they were doing these SAT questions, they didn't perform as well. Okay. Now from this, there's been a whole slew of experiments like this, right, where you change the frame and you can see a systematic underachievement or whatever it is, underperformance of subjects in experiments when the stereotype is evoked in more or less subtle ways. Okay, so that's the stereotype threat literature. Just Google this paper. 10,000 citations, something like that. It's just huge. Okay. So an economist would say, okay, but these guys weren't getting paid anything. Okay. So maybe if we paid people for performing on these questions, maybe then the stereotype threat wouldn't be active. And so there's this really wonderful, missing the quote, wonderful study by Carla Hoff and our co-author, Pandey, in India. There should be a quote, discrimination, social identity, and durable inequality. And what they did is they had children in India, and here they were paid to solve mazes. And they were just given that there's a piece rate for solving mazes. And there were different conditions, 3 different conditions. An anonymous condition where the kids were just asked to solve these mazes. A condition in which the caste was revealed and the kids were asked to solve mazes, and the kids from different high and low castes were in the same room. And the revealing of the caste was just by calling names. So people registered with their names, and then the experimenter called their name, so-and-so come here, so-and-so come here, so-and-so come here. And they were put in a room and they were asked to solve mazes. Again, all they're doing is getting paid a piece rate. Okay? And then there was one where the caste was revealed, but the high and low caste were in different rooms, or they were just done in different, I don't know if they were different rooms, or they just were not present. I've forgotten the detail. Again, I don't know the Indian context very well, but I think it was the Dalit. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, I don't know the exact caste descriptions, but I believe if you go back to the paper, I think it said Dalit. Okay.
So I think it's maybe a good moment to have a few minutes discussion, because I've been facing that with some experiments myself, and I think Shahar is a good person maybe to bring into the discussion. And this is about the role of incentives. So I recently had the pleasure of having a long conversation with Ariel Rubinstein on incentives, and of course I know that the Kahneman-Tversky paper does not have any incentives. So where are we in this? It's a big issue. So people like Ariel think it's just a huge barrier to entry. And I think my understanding is that incentive effects are rather modest. Whether you pay people or you don't doesn't seem to make a huge difference. Where is the state of the art here?
So I don't know, but let me just tell you what happens here.
Yeah, but I was thinking, because you were saying, you started with this 10,000 cited paper.
And so why should we
take this seriously?
Yeah.
And I'm just
thinking, you're right.
We could have a few minutes discussion.
No, it's a good question. So what actually happened is, despite the incentives, the lower caste subjects completed fewer mazes, and both caste revealed conditions.
Sorry, I read it.
Yeah. So the lower caste subjects completed fewer mazes, and both caste revealed conditions relative to control. So even though they had the same incentives to complete these mazes, revealing caste led to underperformance. Okay? So now I don't know the answer to this incentive question.
Where is the state of the art here?
So, of course, there are
my own opinion.
How can spending money be convenient?
No, because first it's people that have, we are.
That's right.
That's how it is. Some people have enough money for this.
Yes.
We are not talking about rocket science, right? This is.
Sure.
Okay. So, so two things. So first, let's start with experiments that actually have incentives. Many experiments that have incentives, and this might be a good rule. This is actually when I refer a paper or check it as an editor, this is one of the first things that I'm checking. Many people that are actually have very strong views that you need monetary incentives. The payoff function is very flat. So in my optimal decision, in my worst decision, I'm losing 10 cents. So the first thing that you can see in experiment, you should look how the payoff function look like, and you'll see that many times we give basically incentives, but the payoff function is very flat, so it's very hard to compare, because also the papers that are giving incentives are not using the incentives in order to actually generate optimal behavior. My own experience with this, I think that the basic question that I asked is, let's see if creating incentives decrease economic rationality. Because if you introduce incentives to gains, then for example in gains there are other things that I can do. I want to prove, I want to do other things. So the basic question is, increasing incentives by a lot, does it increase economic rationality? And the answer is yes. Absolutely.
Okay, so this is actually really great because I have I cut the slides, but I shouldn't have. But in the experiment that we do, we were very conscious about varying the price. So here, for example, the price isn't very. What you kind of want, okay, there's this effect, but how? When does this effect go away? At some point, if you increase, these are actually pretty. You earned a lot of money in the Indian context here. But there's always the argument that if the price is sufficiently high, then you stop acting irrationally, or whatever this might be. So in the experiment which we did, and I've unfortunately cut the slides, we see a price effect. We've explicitly designed the experiment to have it be more or less expensive to discriminate against people, or inequality was more or less expensive to self. And when did you stop doing it? At what point? At what point were you willing to pay, or you weren't willing to pay? So I guess that's the experimental reason for including an incentive.
Yeah. So I'll just continue and say one thing. I think sometimes casual observations actually is helpful, and people are thinking about the laboratory and the real world. Now the laboratory is the real world. These are real people. It's not the wild maybe, but it is the real world. And to say that in the laboratory incentives don't matter, it's like to say in some place in the real world incentives don't matter. So anyone that says this, I say, look, I give you X dollars, or I'll pay you 10X dollars to do something. Do you think that you'll basically work harder if I'll give you 10X? And the answer is of course yes. So to think that incentives matter different in the laboratory than they matter in the real world, I think it's completely ridiculous. Maybe we don't design the incentives correctly in the laboratory. But if the incentives were designed correctly to actually give incentives, people will start moving.
It also says then that you can imagine experiments that you might run where you kind of over-incentivize people relative to what they might see in the real world. So you see behaviors you wouldn't
Well,
expect.
so you want the crossing point. So you want the crossing point. This is the point. You need a sufficient variation in the incentives. So back to your falsifiability, right? You need sufficient variation in what you're studying to be able to see circumstances where it happens and circumstances where whatever this phenomenon is doesn't. And you want to see the conditions under which whatever it is happens and the conditions under which whatever it is doesn't. That's the way you would.
That's right. But I'll just
go ahead.
But let me just, there are all of these experiments that are coming from psychologists trying to show that economists are wrong. So they are increasing incentives and performances are going down. But this is usually when the experimental test is a test that you are very unfamiliar with. So for example, I'll take you and I'll ask you, to do something like shooting a ball to the basket. No one there. Then I'll bring you in the halftime of an NBA game. You'll do it for $50,000. Of course, you're more likely not to do this. Does it mean that you're irrational? Does it mean that economic theory doesn't work? Of course not.
At this point, sorry, you should continue.
But you won't, so go ahead.
I was just going to say, if I remember right, you were saying that the environment in the lab is there are so many differences with the world that the money thing is a distraction. But maybe I'm not paraphrasing him. You probably have had long discussions with him.
Yeah,
about this as well.
I had many
And this is not a good
conversations
place
with him.
to
I
discuss.
wouldn't call them pleasant. You said it was pleasant conversation.
Yeah, because, you know.
Yes, I look. The environment in the laboratory is not different in how peculiar it is from many other environments in the real world. It is a different environment. But to think that we are on a different planet where money doesn't matter is, the comment, I must say, is so ridiculous that it reminds me all of this, in the United States, human subject, the protection of human subject became completely, every experiment has to go through human subjects. And usually on these committees, there is, of course, selection bias, and the English professors and all the people that are not doing any experiments are sitting there. And then they see experiment that you actually want to give money, and they are saying something like, you are corrupting our students. How can you do something like this? They will think that science is about getting money. It's like the students don't live in the real world, and they know that there is money, that money is attached to performances. To think that, it's just, I really think it's kind of an absurd view.
Okay, so let's move on. I know it's actually, so by the way, I think this is actually a fascinating subject. This bit about incentives, and I will talk to you later about a wonderful book by a colleague. No, I'm completely with you, but it's, there is a view that when you introduce incentives, you are reducing choice. That you're already corrupting the choice, or you're framing the choice just by the fact of having incentives. So I've seen this view expressed, again, we can, but of course the world is full of these incentives. And I think what's interesting is to analyze the way they're used.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, good. So let's move on. So we're back to identity and inequality, and here's an experiment which shows this evocation of caste leads to underperformance by the lower caste folks, okay? And it's just a stereotype threat kind of design. Okay, so here are some other ones that some of you may be familiar with. I'm just going to kind of go through them. So this is discrimination in a segmented society. I absolutely love this paper. I don't know. I can hear what Shahar has to say. So this is a test for taste versus discrimination versus stereotypes. Actually, let me just go to what, I don't have time to go through all of the nuances. Let me just tell you the experiment. These are with Israeli Jewish students. The contrast is between those from European origin versus those from Eastern origin, which is identifiable by last name. And there were different games which the subjects played with each other. There's a trust game, and the result is that less money was sent to subjects with Eastern origin names, though the return was about the same, which meant
Sorry, Eastern here
is
Sephardic and Ashkenaz Jews.
yes.
The European would be considered Ashkenaz Jews, and the Eastern would be considered Sephardic Jews.
So it's those from the Orient, from Iraq or Spain or Morocco, versus those from Russia, Poland, and so on. Okay, so
it's easily recognizable by last name.
Okay.
Right. So it's somebody who's got the last name like Rubenstein versus, give me a name. Whatever. Okay. So it's easily recognized.
No, there are many.
Well,
I was looking for a name of someone that we will know, an economist with such a name, and this was hard to find.
Well, because again, there's a discriminatory, there's historically a discrimination in Israel between these two sets of folks. Those who come from Europe, okay. So those who come from Europe, Poland, they're the original settlers and so on, and then there was a migrations later on from the Moroccans, the Iraqis, and so on. And so there was they tended to be unemployed, and there was a whole, minority majority discussion with. Well, it depends. It depends because okay. So this.
I was looking for a name that you'll know, but I couldn't find. But there are plenty of others that you just wouldn't never heard about.
Okay, so that's the context. You want to think about a majority group and a minority group. Okay, that's a way to think about it. As a majority group and a minority group, or dominant culture group and non-dominant culture group. And here you see that indeed. In the trust game, less money was sent to those with the Eastern origin, though the return was about the same. So these folks from Morocco or Iraq or wherever they were from were just as trustworthy, though they weren't trusted. Okay, and the dictator game, this more about The same was sent to each type, but in the ultimatum game, more was sent to the folks from the Eastern community, because perhaps the idea is that there was more a notion that folks from these communities were more likely to reject a low offer. Okay, so this is just an example of discrimination in a segmented society, right? So trying to understand, do you actually see differences in strategic play among groups? And so you see evidence for stereotypes rather than discrimination, which I can go into how they, the distinction between these games, but I don't have time. But kind of interesting, this trust result was only for men. Okay.
So this is a setting, going back to your previous slide, where the external identities were preserved.
Yes.
They were not created in the lab.
No, so none of these that I'm doing now, all of these so far we're exploiting existing identities. Okay. So here's one from the United States, measuring trust. So this is, again, I'll just go through it briefly. So you have Harvard students, and the distinction here is basically white and non-white, whereas in the Harvard context, non-white means Asian. And they found that subjects are less trustworthy, they sent back less when the partners were of different social categories. So now if you match people of different social category, you're going to send back less to them in a trust game. Okay, so now let me move to, this is a sampling. There's many more. There's stuff with Swiss Army platoons and so on. Okay, I just want to give you a sense that, actually, it's not many more. It's more that there are more, and this is an interesting area that we can start working in, is trying to understand why I like the Israeli experiment so much. It was very, well, you can tell me whether you like it, but I like it because it really used the social context of Israel in an interesting way. And so it was very attentive to the stereotypes and to how indeed people may be reacting to people of different types. And so that's what I understand. If you're going to do work in this area, you kind of want to be attentive to the social context in which you're working. Okay. Okay, so now I want to get to experiments about social preferences. So a lot I don't have to say because Shachar told us a lot about these kinds of experiments. So we know that there's many experiments out there where subjects allocate income to self and other. And we know there's a lot of experiments which show inequity aversion or fairness. Different words are used for different payoff functions and so on, or social welfare maximization, which we could really call total income maximization. And some of the findings are that people are not only self-interested, indeed they're concerned about fairness, or they're concerned about total welfare, total income maximization, or so on. These citations here are just a subset. I put them up here because these are the ones that we actually build on. There's many more. Okay, so the experiments on social preferences and identity can be traced back to this history of social psychology experiments. So we heard about the Robbers Cave experiments. Who was that? Who told us? Larry? Was it Larry Bloom who told us about the Robbers Cave? Okay. So the Robbers Cave experiment was you bought these kids off to this park in Oklahoma. There's these summer camps and so on. This enormous operation. And you see that these kids actually developed these alternative identities and were about to beat each other's heads in. Okay, so that's the Robbers Cave experiment. The tradition in sociology was to, so people saw that as social, and so they want to think about the opposite. What are the smallest conditions you need to generate group effects? So that's why it's called minimal groups. You may understand this terminology, minimal group. You bring subjects into the laboratory, you don't haul them off to some summer camp for 2 weeks. You bring them up into the laboratory and you divide subjects into groups by arbitrary criteria, and you see that they exhibit the same kind of behavior as they did in this summer camp. So this is the Todgeville and Turner group experiments and paradigm. So they divided subjects into groups by preferences over paintings. Clay and Kandinsky are the famous pairs of painters. They bring the subjects into the lab. And when they asked people, what was the task that they asked people to do, they were actually boys, adolescent boys, and they were given a table of payoffs for people in their group and people outside of their group, but there was actually no payment. It was just points. They're just points, and nobody got paid for anything, and their own points weren't involved. It was just, here's somebody who's in your group, here's somebody who's out of your group. Pick what you think, which do you like best among these points, these pairs of points. And a lot of subjects, I forget the actual number, picked the point spread, right, that maximized the difference between the groups. Okay, so that's the idea, is that they're maximizing difference. Okay? So that's the experiment. So the minimal group paradigm and the finding that the subjects were trying to maximize the difference between outcomes. Okay, so Chen and Lee basically, where they're sort of bringing the identity and economic stuff that George and I worked on, and I'm not going to go through it exactly how it would work here, but they bring that into an experiment where they try and understand social preferences in groups. And they use this minimal group paradigm. The key thing is that they're also using this minimal group paradigm from the social psychology experiment. And they're trying to understand, in some sense, one way you can interpret this back to this incentive study, right? This incentive question. They want to see if your own payoffs are involved. First of all, if there are payoffs involved, real money payoffs, and if your own payoffs are at stake, right? What level of payoffs would you be choosing for self and other? Okay? All right, so they bring subjects into the lab. They allocate income to self and others. They bring subjects into the lab. They divide them into groups by these criteria. They have different kinds of treatments, either just Klee and Kandinsky paintings or Klee and Kandinsky groups where they actually do some sort of chat game to try and elicit or create more of a group feeling of belonging. And these subjects allocate income to self and to others. So now self is involved. They allocate income to self and to others. There's also, they also do some other tasks, but let me just focus on that. And this other could either be somebody in your group or somebody out of your group, okay? So income money to me and somebody else, me to another somebody else, and that somebody else could either be in my group or out of my group, okay? And they find that subjects are less fair or less inequity averse to those in the other group. Okay, so people generally are fair or inequity averse, whatever precise word you want to use. Inequity averse, I think, is the precise word here. Subjects are inequity averse generally, on average, but they're less inequity averse when it comes to somebody who's outside of their group. Okay, so that's the finding. So you get a group effect or an identity effect on social preferences. So people are inequity averse overall, but less identity averse, inequity averse when it comes to somebody outside their group. Okay, so that's the literature. And so what we've done, in an experiment that I'll run through very quickly, is we've tried to understand the sources, perhaps, of these identity effects on social preferences. So we have an experiment where we have two kinds of treatments. One is a minimal group treatment, right, where we are doing the same thing. We're dividing subjects into groups according to some arbitrary, choices over paintings, and we're also dividing subjects into groups according to their political affiliation. So we have both a real world group and a minimal group in the same experiment with the same tasks. And the idea is to see whether identity or strength of identity matters to individual behavior. So in just a minimal group paradigm, you can't pick up whether some individual is more attached to the group or less attached to the group. Right? All you see is a generic kind of group effect. What we were after here is, can we see that we wanted an actual identity effect. Are people who are more attached to the group to which they've been assigned more exhibit more discriminatory behavior or whatever biased behavior? Okay? So that's the idea. So in order to do that, you have to look at individual social preferences. You have to estimate individual preferences or get some sort of statistic, okay, on individual behavior and match that with individuals' underlying demographics or characteristics, which we will interpret as being more or less attached to the group. Right? So you can't just look on average across people. You have to think about individuals. Okay, and so there are two hypotheses which are tested. One is that subjects will act differently in group versus out group. So just do we reproduce the Chen and Lee kinds of results? So do we see that? And the other is, does behavior depend on the extent to does behavior depend on the extent to which people identify with the group? So this is the new part. Does group meaning matter? And are these group effects more, will people respond more to being placed in a group when they identify with that group. Okay? So we want to see, do people respond more to being placed in a group if they actually identify with it? Okay? Let's see what comes next. Okay, so let me just give you, I'm not going to have time to go through a lot of this, so let me just give you a little bit of something to sort of run you through this. So let me translate this sort of general hypotheses into actually what we're going to test. The first thing is that we're going to see whether the political group, so when subjects are placed in the political group versus the minimal group, do we see that their behavior is more biased? Because we think that somehow the political group is more powerful, it's a real world group, right? And do we see that subjects are going to exhibit more of this in-group, out-group bias in the political group condition rather than in the minimal group condition, right? That's the first thing. And then the other thing is in the political group condition, we can distinguish between those people who are more or less attached to the political group to which they've been assigned. Because we're going to have two groups. One is the Democrats and one is the Republicans. And in the Democratic group, we've placed all of those subjects who call themselves Democrats. And in the Republican group, we've placed all of those subjects who've called themselves Republicans. But in the Democrat group, we've placed also all of those people who say that they're politically independent, right? So they do not belong to a political party, but they share the same positions as the Democrats. So they're in the Democrat group, but they're not actually Democrats. You with me? So the idea is that's the variation. Oh, same with the Republicans, right? Independents who are placed in the Republican group, but who are not Republicans. They do not say, I'm a Republican. So we've got a group, divisions. So in this group, we've got people who say they're Democrats, and they're in the Democrat group. And we have people who say they have all these political opinions, and we put them in the Democrat group, but they do not say, I'm a Democrat. They do not answer. In fact, when we ask them that question, they choose a different option. They say, I'm independent. Okay? So that's the variation on which we see the strength of identity, strength of attachment to the group, the strength of identity. Okay. Okay. All right, so let me tell you the results. Okay, so the first thing is that we see systematic heterogeneity of individual behavior. So 20% of subjects are selfish, meaning they maximize their own payoffs in all conditions. So 20% of subjects are not affected by anything. They simply choose so this is the actual task. So it's really, really simple. They're faced with these matrices. This is money for themselves. This is money for the other person. This is another choice of money for self versus money for other person. And what we did is we varied these so we can get price effects, right? And so first we see systematic heterogeneity of individual behavior. So 20% of people are selfish all the time, in all conditions, the control, the minimal group, and the political group. And 5% are dominance seeking in all conditions. What dominance seeking means here is status seeking. Many different, competitive is the other word that's been used for it, is that they're trying to maximize the difference between own payoffs. And they're willing to give up money to increase the difference in payoffs. Yes?
Selfish means zero to the others.
No, selfish means most money for me. Who cares what the other person gets?
So they all give them some money and they can allocate it.
Yeah, let me just show you this. Okay, this is the literal slides. Okay, so this is what the subject saw. So you see this, and you choose between the top row or the bottom row. If you choose the top row, you are picking 140 for you and 40 for the other person. If you pick the bottom row, you're giving up 20 for yourself, but the payoffs are equal. Okay. So here, if you pick the top row, you're getting 140 for yourself and 100 for the other. Here, if you pick the bottom row, though, you're giving up 20 for yourself, but the other person's going down to 20. So you're losing money, but the other person's losing more. So you're increasing the spread between the two. Okay, so you're maximizing the difference if you choose the bottom row. So that's what we call dominance seeking, inequality loving, competitive is the other word for it, status seeking. Okay, the idea is you're maximizing the difference as long as you're on top. Here, if you pick the top, you're maximizing total income. If you pick the bottom, you're getting the same, but the other person is getting 60, right? So some people will choose the bottom. They're the same. So here it's cheap, right? It's free. It's free for them to do this, to choose the bottom, but make the other person worse off. That's what I mean by varying the price, right? So sometimes it's free, sometimes it's expensive, and so on. Okay, so now we get a sense of what these subjects are actually doing. All right, let me go back. Actually, let me just go through, now that I've done this, let me just run through the experiments and then I'll say the results. So I'll skip the summary, we'll just get into it. So, okay, so to give you a sense of actually how the experimental session worked, first they received the instructions. The asocial control is where they were being presented these matrices, and it was just, they were told that we were giving money to some other participant in the experiment. Okay. Then they were in the minimal group or the political group treatment. It was randomized as to whether the minimal group treatment or the political group treatment came first. There was a survey, and then they were given, they were divided into groups, and they were told they were divided into groups, and then they were given these matrices. And depending on what they got first, they got the other treatment second. And then there was a post-experiment survey where we asked them all the normal questions about demographics, gender, major, but we also asked them why they did what they did. And it turns out they knew why they did what they did, their motives exactly matched their behavior. So it seems these guys actually knew what they were doing. Okay. All right, so that's the run-through of how the experiment works. Here is the political treatment. So in the political treatment, here's the slide that they saw. Do you consider yourself a Democrat, Republican, Independent, or none of the above? So if you said you were a Democrat or a Republican, you got a slide that looked like this. Are you strong or moderate? Strong, moderate. We actually thought that this would be interesting too. Turns out not to be. So if you're a Democrat, are you strong or moderate? If you called yourself an Independent or none of the above, you got a screen that looked like this. Do you consider yourself closer to the Democratic Party or Republican Party? Okay? And if you called yourself closer to the Democratic Party, you were put in the Democrat group. And same with the Republican Party. We also asked them 7 questions about political opinions about really big issues at the time in the United States. So gay marriage was one of them, Bush tax cuts were another one of them, and so on. And so that way we could compare whether indeed these people who called themselves independent, but then we put themselves in the Democrat group, had similar political positions. Were they observationally equivalent but for belonging to the political party? Okay. So this is the tasks that they did. Okay, so let's analyze their choices. So for each match, a subject is picking between 2 allocations, money for self and money for others, or a different money for self and money for others. And we can divide these, the choices between these names, which we call these social preferences. You are selfish if you always pick, oh, by the way, so I'm going to sometimes I will call this the bottom row, though in the actual experiment, whether there was more money in pi I prime or less was randomized. Okay? So pi I prime I might call the bottom row, but it was randomized as to where it appeared. So if you always pick more money for yourself, no matter what the other cells are in the matrix, we're just going to call you selfish. Again, the words aren't great. If the difference between the 2 payoffs is smaller and you pick that row, then we'll call you inequity averse. If the sum is bigger, we'll call you total income maximizing. And if the difference between the 2 is bigger, we'll call you dominant seeking or status seeking. Yeah.
You have a cutoff, like what does it mean always? Like always is because I am mentioning.
Yeah. Well, we actually have to do some estimation. So I'll get to that in just a second. So there's 26 matrices. These are time choices, and you saw the matrices. And we did this. We varied these numbers so we could possibly get at this. How much am I willing to give up in order to make the other person worse off? How much am I willing to give up for self in order to equalize payoffs and so on? Okay. From just looking at the behavior, we can't tell what people are actually doing. I'm just giving names to this right now. Okay. What we actually have to do is do an estimation of a utility function. So Shachar presented this utility function. This is the Fair, Schmidt, Charnes-Rabin utility function. Okay. So which we know has its problems. So this is the Fair, Schmidt, Charnes-Rabin utility function. Is also the one that Chen and Lee used, so we're continuing to use it despite all of its problems. So in this utility function, so individuals have utility over own income and others' income. Beta I is the weight I place on own income. Rho I is the weight I place on the income difference between me and the other person when I am making more than the other person. Sigma I is the weight on the income difference between me and the other person where I am making less than the other person. So this is the idea that I might behave differently. This is that other part of the utility function, the other part of the indifference curve that Shachar was drawing, when I am making less than the other person. And so what you would do is we estimate the parameters of this utility function. So here was the question. You estimate the parameters of this utility function, and depending on how your parameters turn out, you can say whether these people fit one of those categories well or not. So for some of them, if you estimate, for example, sigma equals 0 and rho negative, you could either be, I'm flipping around the terminology here, inequity averse or social welfare maximization, total income maximization. You can't tell, right? But if rho I turns out to be positive and sigma I turns out to be negative, it means that you're always dominant seeking. Whenever you get a chance, you will indeed choose to maximize the difference, except that you might worry about your own income. Okay? So you estimate the parameters of this utility function, and if the parameters are such that you fit in these boxes, like here you can't tell, like this one you can't tell, if you estimate the parameters of the utility function, you can't tell, okay, are they inequity averse or are they dominant seeking? You can't tell. Okay? You with me? So you estimate the parameters of this utility function, and then you look at the box, and that will correspond to those names that I had on the previous slide. Okay? You got it? Okay, so what's the estimation? So we do the standard thing. This is a discrete choice problem. We assume logistic errors, and we we do a maximum likelihood estimation of these utility function parameters. But we do it with a difference. So what most work does is you assume that these parameters are the same across all subjects. Not all work. There's a lot of people who don't do this, but you look at the population estimates. You basically assume that everybody's got the same utility. Every person is an observation. Every person's choice is an observation of this same utility function, and you estimate beta, sigma, and rho. Okay? What we also do is we estimate utility parameters for types of people. So here we say, no, you know what? Not everybody's the same. There's possibly in this population different types of people. Okay, so we have 141 subjects. So maybe there's 141 different types out there. Okay, so there are possibly 141 different types, which would be estimating sigma, beta, and rho I, little sub I, right? And so you can do that. So Shachar was essentially doing that, right? No, you weren't doing that.
We estimate everything at the individual
At the individual level, yeah. So that's what you were doing. And then you were doing hypothesis testing on what would be the beta, sigma, and rho. So you say, okay, I get a beta, sigma, and rho for each individual, and then I say, is beta positive? I do a hypothesis test on that. Is sigma negative? Is rho positive? Right? And then you try to put people into boxes that way. In this kind of situation, you end up, if you do that, you don't categorize about 30% of your subjects, 60 or so. Okay. So we took a different approach, which is to say there aren't 141 different types of people. There are, I'm going to call it X number of people. X less than 141 and bigger than 1. And what we're going to do is we're going to estimate the parameters of this utility function for this X number of types of people in what's called a mixing model. And what this mixing model will produce for us, again, it's maximum likelihood. What this mixing model will produce for us is utility function parameters for each type and the proportion of the population that's of that type. Are you with me? Okay, so you say, likelihood function, tell me what utility function parameters best match this population and the proportion of the population that fits with this particular type. So we estimated 4, we also estimated 5, and we estimated 6. Okay? 4 is the minimum number you could use in order to get those 4 different social preferences that we had up before, 4 different kinds of social preferences. 5, 6, 7 can get you more, more different can give you an additional types, perhaps nuances on these types. Or perhaps they'll give you all the same kind of people. Everybody's selfish, but to different degree. Right? So we had no presumption that these types would map on to those 4 different motives. You could get 6 different types of people. They're all selfish, but beta is higher or lower. Do you understand what I'm saying? Right. Okay. So when we do this estimation, then we do this estimation, and then we go back and we look at individuals, and we say, what's the probability that an individual is of this type? So all that the mixing model gives you is the proportion of the population that's of this type. But it doesn't tell us which individual is this type. So then we go back to individual behavior, match their actual choices, and say, what is the probability that they actually made choices according to each of these types? And then we categorize each individual into a type. Okay, are you with me? All right, so that's what we do. And then with this estimation, we test these differential responses to the group treatment. I should say that in the end, we end up only comparing Democrats to Democratic-leaning independents because we don't have enough Republicans in our sample to make any statistical inference on their behavior. So the patterns look the same, but we don't have enough of them to say anything about them. There's just very few Republicans, which, by the way, is typical on this kind of campus, on Duke's campus. Okay, so what are the results of our estimation? So we do this estimation. So this is in the asocial condition, okay, or a non-group condition. So first, let's look here on average. So if we did the thing where we just estimated these beta, sigma, and rhos, and we did it where we just assumed everybody's the same, and we're just estimating the utility function parameters as if everyone's the same, these are the utility function parameters, and we go back to our box that we had earlier, you know, that box, and I said, okay, I've got beta this and sigma that and this of this sign. Okay, what do I find is that on average, people are inequity averse. They're fair. Okay. Then when we do the mixing model, and we say, okay, I'm going to find 4 types. I have no idea what the utility function parameters are for these types. I don't impose that they have to be selfish or not. What do we get? Okay, so we get 4 types. Here are the 4 types. Okay, and these are the percentage of the population that is of this type. This is the percentage of the population that's of type 2, type 3, and then type 4. Then we go back to our box, and we interpret these utility function parameters by our box, right? You know, that describes this, you know, the different signs of the different parameters of the utility function, and we find type 1 corresponds to being selfish. Well, yeah, the sigma is slightly positive, right? But type 1 corresponds to being selfish. Type 2 corresponds to being total income maximization. Type 3 corresponds to being inequity averse. And type 4 corresponds to being dominant seeking. Okay, you with me? So here, now just to point out, back to our inequity or inequality discussion, 5% of the subjects in the non-group condition, pretty much all they wanted to do. There is a price effect, so beta is positive, right? They won't do this all the time. They care about their own income, right? But not as much as these guys do, right? They care about their own income, but what they really care about is maximizing the difference. So when I said, are there preferences for inequality? Some people are willing to pay for an unequal outcome. Okay. Now let's see what happens in the group condition. So I'm just going to, let me just, so what we do then is we categorize subjects into these groups and we get distributions. Okay, so this is the population. This is just what I had. And here, this is in the, these are the same numbers I had before. 25, 37, 33, and 5, right? So in the non-group, this is the control, and you're allocating money to another subject. 25% are selfish, 37% maximize total income, 33% are inequity averse, and 5% are this dominant seeking type. Okay, you with me? Now we're going to do the minimal group. And let's just look at this column, which is how you allocate money to somebody who's outside of your group. 30% of subjects are selfish, 21% maximize total income, 33% are inequity averse, and now 16% are dominant seeking. So you get this big jump in people who are wanting to maximize the difference. Now let's do the political group. So now the political group, we get 35, 13, 31, and 21. So now we're up to, say, 21. So we're, I was arguing that we have preferences for inequality. Now 21% of people, of our subjects, are have preferences they are willing to pay to increase the difference. So they're inequality loving as long as they're earning more. Right? So now I've got, that's a preferences for inequality. Now, I want to relate those preferences for inequality to identity, because of course that's the title of my lectures, is inequality and identity. Okay, so is there an identity effect here? You know, is this somehow an identity effect? Is this coming from something? What's really interesting is yes and no is the answer. Okay, yes and no. Okay, let's see if I can run through that. I'm not going to have time to show you everything, so let me just talk it through. So the question is, what we've got mixed up in here, especially in the political group, we've got the Democrats and we've got the Democratic-leaning independents who are both in the same group and playing against another person, right? So I want to see, for example, is this all coming from the Democrats or the people who are independents but are stuck in the Democrat group, right? That's kind of what I want to know. And I also want to know, is it the minimal group thing which is driving stuff, or is the salience of the real world group driving things? Okay? Those are the types of questions I want to answer. And I'm just going to tell you the answer. Maybe I can show you the numbers in a bit. Well, why not? I'll show you the numbers. Maybe it's easier to tell the story. By the way, we can see how different subjects change. I would obviously do not have time to do that. Okay, so let's first look at the Democrats. Okay, so these are the Democrats. The Democrats, this is how they act in the non-group condition. Okay? So, by the way, all of those dominance-seeking folks in the non-group condition are Democrats. Okay. So maybe these are our guys at Yale. I don't know. Okay, so what I want you to focus on here is, so if you look at the Democrats and how they change across these conditions, let's just look at this number, because this is the inequality-loving folks. 7% are dominance-seeking in the non-group condition. 19% of the Democrats are dominance-seeking in the minimal group condition, and 24% in the political group condition. So you get a bit of a bump, right, from the minimal group to the political group. So the idea is that the minimal group is less salient than the political group for Democrats. You get a bit of a bump in this, but overall, you cannot reject that these are the same. So you with me? So Democrats, in some sense, when you put them in the minimal group condition, they are going to act differently towards the other. When you put them in the political group, they also act differently towards people outside of their group, but not very differently than they did just towards an arbitrary outgroup member. Okay? So for Democrats, the salience of the political group relative to the salience of the minimal group did not actually seem to be that strong. It's there, but you can't pick it up statistically. Are you with me? Yeah.
Actually, so you said that the minimal group was based on preferences, right?
Clay and Kandinsky paintings. Clay and Kandinsky paintings.
How about if you have a really minimal group is in the Chen and Chen paper rather than the Chen and Lee paper, so where the people are randomly allocated, so it's not really based on...
Yeah, so I don't know. I don't have the answer to that because I didn't do it. So let me just keep going and show you the results. Okay? So, so here, this is the really interesting point. So now I'm just going to look at the Democratic-leaning independents. In the non-group condition, right, this is what the Democratic-leaning independents do, right? And now look at what they do in the minimal group condition. It's virtually the same. Okay, do you see that? The Democratic-leaning independents. So these are people who say, I am not a Democrat. They say I'm an independent, or I'm none of the above. And their behavior, or the distribution of their social preferences, does not change when they are put in a minimal group condition. So there is no group effect on this subset of the population in our study. Okay? You put these people in the political group condition, and you do see an effect. But what they're doing here is different than what the Democrats do. So when I said that the answer to my questions was sort of yes and no, we kind of have we think a very interesting set of results. One, and I think this is a comment on all of these studies about group effects and so on. So there's a lot of, and social preferences. So we know there's a lot of heterogeneity in social preferences. People have studied that. We know that. There's some people who are inequity averse, some people who are selfish, and so on. We get that in our experiment too. What we're picking up here is heterogeneity in group effects. There are some people who are not affected by being in an arbitrary group. And this matches who they say they are. They say they're politically independent. So what we think we've picked up on is a subset of the population that is potentially just a not groupy set of people. They're not very groupy. You put them in a group that doesn't matter to them, and they don't do anything. They act exactly as they would have if they weren't in a group. You put them in a situation, so this is the type of people that they're turned on by a salient group, but they're not turned on by an arbitrary group. You with me? So these political independents, they're not turned on by the group condition, but they are turned on by the political condition. Okay? But they still don't act the same way of Democrats. Now the Democrats, on the other hand, I'm going to call them groupie people. Okay, they're really groupie people. They like joining groups. I don't really know, but I'm just inferring because they say they're part of the political party. They like joining groups. They're groupie. You put them in the middle group condition, they act like they're in a group. They change their behavior. Okay? You put them in the political group condition, they act even a bit more groupie. But what's really taking up the groupiness is just being in a group. Okay? So that's picking up on another kind of heterogeneity, and this goes back to, I think a lot of us were talking about this, and I love this identity stuff, I love this network stuff, but we also want to find out when it's not happening, right? So these are people for whom the little t in our high school model that we were talking way back in the beginning, my beginning of my lectures, that little t, maybe it's 0. Maybe they don't care about being in a group. Right? So again, we're getting heterogeneity in the population, the extent to which these identity effects or these group effects may be mattering. So it matters a lot for some people and maybe not for others. And if we do, hopefully, a well-constructed experiment, we can start to pick that up. And I have no time whatsoever, but I will put my slides online. There's this wonderful empirical work going on. I just want to sell one. Wow, they're both beautiful. Let me just sell 2 in 2 minutes, 1 minute each. These are all new. Okay, so this is a paper by Marianne Bertrand and co-authors. So they literally test this gender norm in the United States. So the gender norm in the United States is that women shouldn't earn more than men. Okay, that's a commonly known gender norm. You can find it in all the sociology. You can find it in the General Social Survey. You can find it everywhere, that this is a gender norm that people adhere to. They use US administrative data and US Census data. And they find that the distribution of the share of household earned by the wife exhibits a discontinuity at 1/2. Okay? They also say when a randomly chosen woman becomes more likely to earn more than a randomly chosen man, marriage rates decline. Okay, so they picked it up, this gender norm, in the administrative data. Okay? It's a gorgeous paper. This is also a beautiful paper. So that one, by the way, was about inequality. Women can't earn more than men. We got all the norms going on. This is a little bit different. It's potentially an ingredient to inequality, an ingredient to economic policy. So this is about anti-market culture, the legacy of the Pale of Settlement after the Holocaust. Again, really new paper. And what they do is they look at voting patterns among the population in Russia which lived on either side of the border of the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement was where Jews were allowed to settle under the Tsar, right? And so the idea is that there were different Jewish along the border. You kind of cut this border. They argue that it's an arbitrary border. On one side of the border, the local population lived with Jews. On the other side of the border, the local population did not live with Jews. Okay? The Holocaust came. The Jews are wiped out. Right? There are no more Jews. But yet, do we see a persistence of the Jewish presence? And do we see a persistence of the Jewish presence in the voting patterns? And here, okay, they find that, okay, this is the result. In the voting patterns, they see different attitudes towards market policy. So they look at the voting patterns and they see on the side of the border where people lived with Jews, okay, that the current population is less likely to vote for pro-market policies or candidates with pro-market positions. Okay, you ready? You got that? And the idea is that these communities, when they lived side by side, the local population, when they lived with the Jewish population was also local, but when these two populations, the non-Jewish and Jewish populations, lived side by side, the non-Jewish population and the Jewish population were developing separate identities with different values, because the Jewish population was constrained to certain kinds of occupations, as we know, and so on. So the non-Jewish population were identifying themselves in opposition to the Jewish population and vice versa, and this identity has persisted to voting patterns today, these opposition between the two communities. That's the argument. And of course, they have all of the, it's, again, gorgeous paper. Both of the papers are beautiful in the sense that they've got the information about the norms. They go back and they don't just say they're the norms. They go back and look at the General Social Survey. They look at the history. They look at the anthropology. They've got the data. The data is beautifully analyzed. They've got the outcome variables, which are economic variables of interest, right? And of course, they're testing about identity effects. So I love that as well. So these are just some examples, and there's more work going on in this area, and I'd love to see you guys getting involved with it too. Thanks.
Thank you.